Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach. Today is January 5th, 2022. It's a new year. Welcome to the new year. I hope you're enjoying it. 4 or 5 days down. Um, I've found some interesting things to talk about tonight, and I was privileged to be at a lecture online by Professor Norman Fenton. He is a mathematician, British. Believe he's currently a professor of risk information management at Queen Mary University of London. He's also director of Agena, Agena, a company that specializes in risk management for critical systems. And I was very much fascinated by his lecture on Tuesday at pandata.org. And he presented a very clear-sighted view, which I will take a stab at reproducing for you. I'm hoping to get him actually on the show at some point, but he hasn't responded yet. And I thought the information was crucial enough to bring to your attention right now. And I'm going to do my best to be a very much imperfect interlocutor of his information. And I hope I do a reasonable job, a faithful job of presenting it. A lot of what he said was in accord with things I presented here, but he does so quite succinctly, and he, he's a mathematician. He's done a lot better analysis than I can present to you, and it's much more organized. So without further fanfare or delay, I'd like to get to his slide set. First one here is actually blank. I'm going to go backwards one and give his introductory page. That's who he is, what he looks like. And you can read what kind of drove him to get into this. So we've gone, very rapidly to, thinking that science means, kind of an open debate and trying to figure out what things are and how to reproduce them. Generally speaking, science has two basic definitions. One is the body of knowledge, and the other refers to the scientific process, which only validates the winners and losers through repeat experimentation. If you watch the NFL, the NBA, you can find the champion because they have to go through the other teams. They have to kind of battle, and it may not be perfect every year. It may not be the best team wins the championship, but it's certainly not the worst team that wins the championship. And they go at each other tooth and nail, oftentimes for 7 games in World Series or basketball and whatnot. And the final answer comes through a fair amount of work and effort. It's not enough just to pronounce the winner at the beginning of the season. You can't say, oh, well, LeBron James is on the Lakers. Definitely they're going to win. I mean, they did a couple of years ago, but not now. And how can you tell if LeBron James is not quite up to snuff or his team isn't? Well, you have to play, 80 games, and then you play, another 20 games afterwards, and so forth. And, Tom Brady, is he the greatest player ever? Well, he may very well be, might not be, might have just been lucky. But year after year, if you prove yourself, then you percolate up towards the top. The same has to be true with science. So it's not enough just to state things. You have to have them kind of go through the same, trials and playoffs that sports players do. And that's how we figure things out. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of the things he was interested in. He's interested in censorship and cancellation, problems with the data, and then vaccine efficacy and safety. And any of these can get you, as it were, canceled these days. So I'm going to try to bring these up to the fore. So I think he's talking about his own respect within the scientific or analytic community as a professor, respected, and then he's been censored and canceled. And I'm not going to be able to go through, in vast detail everything on his slides because they're not my slides. But here you can see the complications, figuring out patterns within COVID, because there are a lot of complicated factors going on. There might be different scenarios, different places at different times, and different situations in one place as time goes on. So, we oftentimes compare countries, but there are a lot of different things going on in those countries we have to pay attention to. So I'm going to breeze through some of these. Some places infection rates were higher than widely reported, and the fatality rates were lower. Obviously in China, there's been, not seemingly actual data. There might be places where they have bigger concerns than COVID, and they may not be emphasizing the testing. There are parts of Africa where bigger problems are getting fed and doing actual commerce and maintaining rule of law than getting multiple COVID tests when you're not sick. So in Professor Fenton's case, he showed early on that the disease was far less lethal than was being reported. For this, we owe him a debt of gratitude. He did, extensive research into COVID risk factors and symptoms and clinical patterns. And you can stop any of these slides and look at them, but I'm not going to be able to speak to them directly. And he actually made a personalized symptom tracking and risk management app, which I can send a link for later on. Maybe you can read it from the slide as well, but I'll put a link up for that separately. I think this is very useful. I've oftentimes mentioned that coronavirus, COVID-19, Wuhan flu, is a bimodal illness. There are two separate types in a sense. It's the same virus, but the way it affects people elderly and/or with significant comorbidities, that is, other illnesses, is vastly different from how it, deals with people under 50 who are healthy, not taking any medication, so forth. For which, for whom it's really kind of a, maybe a cold or nothing. For kids, mostly it seems to be absolutely nothing. They don't harbor the virus very long. They don't carry much of it. They have, are gone within a day or two. But it certainly hasn't been treated that way. It's been treated as a big societal menace. So, Professor Fenton exposed flaws in reports about certain COVID risk factors. And in order to do this, you kind of have to look at big data sets. And, I'm not going to go over all his work here, but again, you can stop at any point. It became clear from about September 2020 that the entire COVID narrative was being driven by the fundamentally flawed approach of equating a COVID case with a positive PCR test. This is something we've discussed here multiple times. For the course of modern medicine, say from the late 19th century on, a case was simply was when you have something. You're exhibiting symptoms, you have a problem. A case of lymphoma is when you are diagnosed and you have the thing, circulating or sitting in your system someplace. A case of cancer, a case of, peritonitis, a case of, gallbladder disease. We all have gallbladders. We might all have the potential to get gallstones, and probably there's a presence of gallstones in, maybe 30% of women over 45 or something like that. But you don't say they have, a case of gallstones unless they become a problem. You might notice them. So this has become a vast change in the way we address problems by deciding that a case is something for which we see a positive test. Let's see if I can kind of go over this a little bit as well. So things got worse when there was exposure of government data. I just want to go back to this other slide here. So in this case, if you just look at the case numbers, they go up, but the case rate is going down or staying static. So we're seeing this now. We're seeing basically a case-demic where we're doing a lot of testing. So we're noticing a lot of cases, but a lot of these people would have been asymptomatic. So we didn't have as much testing as we have now. We would see pretty much the case rate, the blue line, is not changing that much drastically, but the case numbers, the orange line, are going up. What proportion of people with COVID do not get symptoms? So this is something that Professor Fenton worked on. And he also started to look at the claims of vaccine efficacy and safety. And again, here are a few titles of works he's done. You can reference these. He did manage to get a letter into the American Journal of Therapeutics. This is the only exception to the kind of censorship ban from his work into kind of the mainstream journals. The major medical journals that we always looked up to and respected, such as the Lancet and New England Journal and so forth, they have come down somewhat politically on one side. And so this is, again, not science. This is politics, propaganda, agitprop, whatever you want to talk about. So he was able to get in a letter to the American Journal of Therapeutics, which is a decent journal, but not one of the top 5-10 journals on earth medically with the largest readership. And he talked about a meta-analysis of ivermectin effectiveness. You can look through his other stuff insofar as you can stop and click on one of the things we've had here. So what are the problems with the data? Well, again, it goes back to things I've said before. It's like how you define things. If you define an infestation of your house, let's say you work in the termite business or the insect business, getting pest control or whatever, and you define infestation as one ant within a house. There'd be like PCR testing. If there's an ant in your house, is that a case of infestation? Well, generally speaking, it has to be a certain number of them. They have to be doing damage. They have to be eating away. They have to be making the place, potentially susceptible to, more extensive damage if you don't get rid of the problem. But we are defining these downwards. So if you ran the pest control business and you were selling the, pesticide or the, the big smoking your house or whatever to get rid of them, and you made a profit by that, you might very well, decide that every house in the neighborhood has either a termite or an ant problem based on finding one of them or one nearby or one that might come to your house because, a house down the street had one, and how fast these things can travel. So, what we're seeing right now is a lot of kind of the game of, tag, where people are not necessarily even those who should be tagging. A lot of times they're just, I heard somebody was positive. One of my son's friends was positive at school, so I'm going to withdraw and so forth. Anyway, we get a little bit of these definitional issues currently. So in this case, Fred has no COVID symptoms, tested positive for PCR test. Is that a case? Fred's classified as a COVID case. I guess I got to go back a little bit. So he doesn't go on to develop any symptoms, but 13 days later is critically injured in a car crash and dies 2 weeks after being taken to the hospital. So literally, in this case, Fred is classified as COVID, a COVID hospital admission, and a COVID death. Why does that happen? Well, Professor Fenton's in the United Kingdom. I'm not sure how they manage things there, but here hospitals get something on the order of a $30,000 stipend for treating COVID cases. I think if they make it to the ICU, but maybe just in general. I think there's maybe a gradation of the amount they get. If they get on a ventilator, there's basically certain prizes they get if the cases are, graded out as COVID. So this has been an absurdity. So here's, another case. Jane gets a COVID vaccine and 13 days later tests PCR positive with symptomatic COVID. She is classified as an unvaccinated COVID case because they don't classify you as vaccinated until a couple weeks occur. So the people who are getting COVID vaccines and having complications within a few days from the vaccine potentially, these are not seen as vaccine complications in a medical sense, in a statistical sense. And we have another case here. Peter gets a COVID vaccine and dies the next day from an adverse reaction to it. Peter is classified as an unvaccinated death. Again, because it's not seen that the vaccine, had its 2 weeks to become effective as a protection, but it may very well have done its damage early on. So we're getting into issues about how things are classified, and there's GIGO. I'm sure you've heard of GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So if you put the wrong qualifications and classifications in to begin with, well, it shouldn't be shocking that you're going to get the wrong answers later on, or potentially the answers you want based on what you input. So the key metrics. Number of COVID cases, number of hospitalizations, and number of COVID deaths. So these things should be easy to define, but they are defined differently by you potentially, or if you were running things, than by the people who are actually running things. So as we saw in the other slide, you are potentially a case of COVID if you're in the hospital with COVID, but not you're necessarily there because of COVID. We're seeing this a lot now because they're testing broadly in the hospital, maybe to hunt out and find the treasure of federal payments and so forth. Possibly because they want to make sure they can quarantine people, will give people the benefit of the doubt. But a lot of people are in the hospital and getting tested, and they show up positive, and then their whole case kind of gets flipped around from whatever their peritonitis or gallbladder disease they might have been in for into a coincident COVID case. So their symptoms can get conflated with that. We don't necessarily have a real good answer for this, except better analysis. When we see deaths listed every day, I check my weather or every other day or something, and I always see number of cases, number of deaths. Number of deaths are minuscule compared to the number of cases, and minuscule compared to the number of people who die ordinarily anyway. But we never see these data parsed out. I believe that the median death in the United States is around 82 years old or something of that sort, between 80 and 82, and I think the vast majority of cases have about 4 comorbidities, other illnesses on the order of diabetes, cancer, and so forth. And especially amongst the younger people who have died, I think under 20-year-olds have had there been only a handful of deaths at that age group. And I think around the 7 or 8 deaths that he's I think mentioning in the UK had coincident severe life-threatening illnesses that would have had them pass within a year or two anyway. So, end-stage cancers and so forth. So, how many of the cases are actually symptomatic? How many of these are hospitalized for something other than COVID? How many got COVID after hospitalizations? How many of these died with rather than from COVID? We're never told these. So I salute Professor Fenton for the cool slides and bringing this to our attention. The uncertainty of the data is even worse because everything is based, as I said before, on these kind of like newly defined cases as just something that's positive for PCR. If we'd been doing this for common colds before, I mean, maybe we'd never been out of lockdown. For the last I don't know. I mean, PCR is relatively new, so we can be thankful that at the founding of our country in the first couple hundred years, we didn't have PCR testing, because I think these things can be used and they can be misused. So there's different categories. Has virus with symptoms, has virus but you're not quite symptomatic, has virus but never gets symptoms, no virus but has symptoms, no virus and no symptoms. When we do testing, we can get people who are falsely positive, and Professor Fenton will go into the difference between true positives and false positives. Here they're kind of drawn, but the fraction of which we get depends on the background likelihood of that illness. That's a little complicated, but of a mouthful. Hopefully we can make this clear. So is it a genuinely, truly positive case if somebody has the virus but never exhibits symptoms? This is pretty much what we're seeing with Omicron now. It's kind of a nothing burger. And, as I've mentioned before, most of these viruses, if there's no animal reservoir, not most, I think all viruses, if there's no animal reservoir, it's just going to be passed from human, has to, make itself milder so it doesn't knock down its host, because it doesn't have another host, another animal from which and to which it can, kind of incubate and get strong and knock us down. So if it only has us, it can't kill our host. It's like your dog or your cat. Every now and then they get a little bit feisty and so forth, but they never really bite the hand that feeds them, because I guess they'd be powerless, locked in the house, and so forth. So there's no reason to do that. Viruses don't have brains, but their behavior in a gross sense is similar. If there's no other recourse for them, they will literally die out insofar as viruses are alive in the first place, if they don't have you and your neighbors. So to knock you down and put you down in bed for 3 or 4 days, the virus may very well die with you if you die, and may not be able to be passing around, as well as his viral friends, who are just kind of like, being passed around in a much lighter sense. I used crowd surfing as an analogy last week, and maybe the week before. If you want to be passed around, you have to be a certain weight. If you're too heavy, you'll splat, and you will blot out everybody who would be passing you around. So that's one kind of virus, like Ebola. But the virus we're talking about now is very communicable. So something that's highly communicable without an animal host, kind of a safe place, is going to self-attenuate. This is going to, I'm going to maybe pass over these. I'm not going to be able to get to every slide completely, but this is kind of the Bayesian view. Reverend Bayes, who I think was a 18th century Presbyterian minister in England, if I have that correct. I should know because I wrote an article on it. I'll give you a reference to that later. I had not seen Dr. Fenton's work, but back in the early phases of COVID, last in the spring of 2020, I thought the Bayes theorem would factor into our reckoning of the disease and would give exaggerated numbers of positive cases, false positives essentially, at the beginning and the end of the pandemic. Why is that? Because at those times, the background rate of illness is lower, and it's more likely to find things incorrect when the thing you're looking for is rare. The example I came up with, if I can get this right, is let's say you're interested in finding actual plants, not fake plants. If you are hunting in Miami, let's say you're going in and out of office buildings or on the street or whatever, and you see a plant, in a pot and whatnot, there's very high likelihood it's an actual plant, because the background rate of actual plants in pots in Miami, a nice warm place, is really high. In New York City, you go in and out of office buildings and whatnot, there are going to be far fewer actual real live plants, because the weather's not good. We have winter. And so when you see something that looks like a plant, and you identify those as actual plants, if the background rate of actual plants is low, you're going to have a higher false positive rate. You're going to be picking out things that look like plants. Even if you're aware of plastic plants, you're going to be fooled far more often into thinking it's a true plant in New York City than you'll be fooled in Miami, where there are more actual plants and very few plastic plants. I don't know if that makes any sense. There's a lot of other examples you can give. The other one I think I gave was being a bomb detector, having a device, whether it's a human or mechanical or X-ray, and you are testing for bombs in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in the 1970s. There aren't any. There are very few bombs going to be passed around, pre-terrorism and all that stuff, and versus being a bomb detector in Baghdad or Kabul or your favorite, kind of hotspot around the world. The bomb detector, when he finds a bomb or something that looks like a bomb in Kalamazoo, Michigan, the odds are very, very high that's a false positive. In a place where there are a lot of bombs, the odds that you find true positives is higher and false positives negative, lower, that is. So let's see. I think I recommend you kind of stop some of these slides and look at them and so forth. I'm going to, basically it's kind of what I said here before. So, if you have a, let's see, false positive problem, if the false positive rate is 1%, what are the chances a person testing positive has the virus? It depends on the population infection rate. If you have something that's very rare, only 1 in 1,000, about 10 people are going to have this in 10,000 people. So that's 1 out of 1,000. But since your false positive rate sounds really good, it's only 1%, but 1% of 10,000 is 100. So the odds ratio are that more, if something's very rare, your odds ratio are that when you find a positive identification, almost all of them, in this case, almost 90%, a little more than 90%, are going to be falsely positive. So this is very nicely demonstrated. So here's 9.1% chance of having the virus if the virus is very rare. And the problem is similar when you're testing for asymptomatics. I'm not going to be able to spend huge amounts of time on this. Again, it's not my slide set, but the way to kind of reduce some of these issues is to have a second confirmatory test, because those false positives are not necessarily going to overlap. So if you do independent testing, you can somewhat limit the false positivity. But one pass is not necessarily going to do this. I'm going to maybe skip over this a little bit. But this is a different issue. He was classifying cases on a single gene. And I'm maybe going to pass over this again. It's not my stuff here. Let's see. So there are some issues with exaggeration. But what we're seeing now is high rates of testing, and we're seeing high case rates. But as we've mentioned here before, this is talking about triage calls. I usually look at death rate, whatever, but the severity of the illness is going down, but the cases are going up. So I'm going to end that segment and maybe talk a little bit about vaccine efficacy. And Professor Fenton uncovers some very interesting items here, just looking at the data. And again, part of this is an issue because they are testing the effectiveness by measuring cases. And as we've seen before, cases are, they're a problem of definition, and they can vary in the assuredness with which you have identified a case based on the background, COVID, or whatever thing you're looking for. As we looked from the Bayes slide above, as your rates go down, more positive tests are falsely positive. So there's a problem here with the miscategorization. This, again, naming is really essential. And the way we can name cases whatever we want. The same problem exists with misnaming vaccine status. So, the vaccine has gotten a little bit of a pass for any potential side effects by virtue of not declaring people vaccinated until some time limit has gone by. So if you have a problem from the vaccine in an early stage within a few days, that is not necessarily going to show up in data. And this skews the way things are presented. This is the UK government on vaccine effectiveness. This is a screenshot of an actual table. In each category above the age of 30, the COVID infection rate is much higher in the fully vaccinated than in the unvaccinated. You can see it in this bar chart, which was not on the report. I'm going to skip over this a little bit. Anyway, because of the dependence on ill-defined and easily manipulated definition of both a case and a fully vaccinated person, it's hard to trust claims about vaccine effectiveness. In Dr. Fenton's view, and I'm quoting, it's much more important to focus on the only simple objective way to measure the overall risk benefits of vaccines, which is to compare all-cause mortality of the unvaxxed versus the vaxxed, where the latter is anybody who has received at least one instance, one injection, because adverse reactions are most likely to happen shortly after the vaccination. So if COVID is as deadly as claimed, and if the vaccine is as effective as claimed, then for COVID deaths, there should be a lot more in the unvaxxed than the vaxxed. But on the other hand, this is again quote, if the vaccines are as safe as claimed, then for non-COVID deaths, there should be only a few more through adverse reactions in the vaxxed compared to the unvaxxed. That's a mouthful. I think it's fairly clear, though, that the problem is banding or ignoring people who have just had the vaccination, had problems, including death. And by declaring them, ipso facto unvaccinated, this has skewed data. So we're going to look at just deaths in general, and he does a much better job of this than I can. So there are COVID deaths and non-COVID deaths, and amongst the vaccinated, the non-COVID deaths are slightly higher. Now, mind you, there are more people vaccinated than unvaccinated. So these are proportional deaths. These are proportional rates, but the group on the right is a higher number than the group on the left. I think in the UK, it's probably about 70-80% of the population is vaccinated. So the smaller differential on the right may actually exceed the seemingly larger differential on the left. All-cause deaths, when you do the net effect, there are actually more deaths among the unvaccinated than the vaccinated. There should be fewer deaths amongst the unvaccinated. I'm saying that incorrectly. Anyway, what's actually showing here is, again, a slight benefit for the vaccinated, but it's hard to tell, what those groups are comprised of unless they're normalized for other issues. If they're normalized for age and other illnesses and so forth, it's going to be better to get a handle on whether these data mean very much. It may be that it's significant, it may not be. So again, he brings out that you need to age categorize mortality data by vaccination status. But the problem here is that the vaccination status is not necessarily accurately determined because of the kind of 2-week or 3-week window until somebody's determined to be vaccinated. I'm going to probably see if I can skip through some of these a little more quickly. This is all-cause mortality in the 10 to 59 year group. And the mortality rate seems to be somewhat higher amongst young people in the vaccinated group than the unvaccinated. It could be that these are people who have illnesses. They might be 45 years old with illnesses, lymphoma, hypertension, whatever, and they are, jumping out to get vaccinated earlier, and then the orange bunch, the unvaccinated, are healthier people. So it's hard to say why these lines cross over is a difficulty to figure out at this point. But it's not overwhelming that the vaccinated do better. In fact, for younger people, it seems to be the opposite. So there's higher mortality rate in the vaccinated, but like you said, potentially, a problem with age differentiation. You really need to make things, much more fine. As we get into an, older age group, it looks like the unvaccinated do worse. So this is, again, as I said before, that COVID is a bimodal problem. It's silly to look at the, all of humanity and make 5-year-olds get the same shot that 95-year-olds get. So you can just read along here that the peak in deaths, the mountain you see in the orange, shows up at the same time the first vaccine rollout came. And same thing happens in the older group, 70 to 80. Again, for some reason, the unvaccinated have this kind of mortality bump right when the vaccine showed up. And, I think, I'm not sure if he says it directly, but I believe Professor Fenton's supposition is that what's being called unvaccinated are actually newly vaccinated, and they just have not been categorized as vaccinated, because otherwise it makes no sense to have a blip right at the time the vaccine was being pushed highest. This is 80-year-olds. So why should 80-year-olds should, pretty much the unvaccinated should have the same rate of fatality as the vaccinated as the months go by, but right when the vaccines came out, they were higher. I think this is speaking to an issue regarding the vaccine, and potentially, it could be that people had the illness, they're getting the vaccine. The vaccine's more dangerous for people who've had the illness prior. There's ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement syndrome, I believe, talking about which got Dr. Robert Malone banned from Twitter just the other day, and amongst other things. And so Professor Fenton is a mathematician, not in science or medicine per se, but his math skills are showing something quite interesting here. And again, it strains the same age peak. So I'm going to, I think, skip over some of those things. And he brings on that when you change the date at which you look at the one group versus the other, that is to say, if you were to move, some of the so-called unvaccinated, potentially change their dates based on the vaccine time, you might see something different. But I think this is a point that I'm not going to be able to push forth because I'm not sure I fully understand it. So I'm going to skip over some of this stuff and maybe cut to the chase. So let's see. I think I'm going to maybe stop some of his slides here, because I think we've gone on quite a bit, and maybe reach the end of our broadcast today. But I think the major point here is that you can make something what you want it to be. I forget which character it is in Alice in Wonderland. I think it's Humpty Dumpty, who magically says a word means precisely what he wants it to mean in any given moment, and nothing more, nothing less. It's pretty dictatorial. Alice doesn't take well to it, nor should she. It's you can't eat your cake and have it. Or you can have your cake and eat it. So those things are, it's a pretty precise thing. If you define things in a certain way, you're going to get the answers you want. Like I said before, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. What we really need from the data we are getting is better analysis. And when we see vaccine efficacy and we see this and that, we have to, I think it's probably too late to go back to what root causes are, what determines a case, and what determines who's vaccinated, what's not. But the reckoning will come. These data will be parsed out in a better fashion later on, and we'll see the answers. And it's going to be a shame, a big shame, if we've kind of turned over the world based on people, in a sense, wishing calamity, wishing things worse on us than actually they are. So I'm going to call it a day on this, I think. I will say this about that. I have finished my Zika book. I'm going to be having it published and brought out probably in Brazil in February 2022. But a lot of the same things we see here happen there. It comes down to definitions. What got defined as a case of Zika at the time was nothing that would be defined as a case of Zika today. Ditto microcephaly. So the way these things were defined determined a pandemic that turned Brazil upside down, and a good fraction of the tropical world as well, and still, holds like a sword of Damocles over, hundreds of millions of reproductive age families all over the tropics, because of the bad definition. They were defining Zika cases without ever even having tested anybody for Zika in 2015, and they were defining microcephaly cases based on multiple different standards, none of which were the actual factual ones for that area. Anyway, these things matter. How you define something makes a difference. I hope you had some clarification from this. I hope I didn't do too badly, and I can't do Professor Fenton's work just as well as he can, but hope that he can come aboard in a short period of time. I did want to present his data in the meanwhile because I think it's really important and crucial, not his data so much as his analysis. Thank you very much. I hope you have a good night. And if you want to help and support our work here, please let me know, and have a good